Joanna of Austria went insane after her husband's death and subjected her body to grotesque medical experiments, attempting to become pregnant from animals. But to understand how she became a woman willing to destroy herself this way, we need to go back to the very beginning. Joanna of Austria entered the world on January 24, 1547, in Prague Castle, and her arrival was marked by death. Her mother had died shortly after giving birth to her in 1547, and her father, Ferdinand I, had little interest in the motherless girl beyond using her for a strategic alliance. The Habsburgs operated on cold calculation when it came to their daughters, and Joanna understood from childhood that her life existed only to serve the family's political interests. By the time she reached adolescence, various marriage proposals were considered and rejected based on shifting political needs. Her uncle, Philip II of Spain, initially wanted to match her with his troubled son Don Carlos, but the prince's violent instability made that impossible. Instead, she was promised to Francesco de' Medici, heir to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, in a match that seemed advantageous for both powerful families. Francesco de' Medici made his contempt clear from the beginning. He found his new wife unappealing and had already taken a mistress named Bianca Capello before the wedding even took place. Francesco spent his nights at Bianca's palazzo while the entire Florentine court watched and gossiped. The humiliation was deliberate and constant. Servants smirked when Joanna entered rooms. Courtiers made jokes about the unwanted wife who could not hold her husband's attention. Francesco would sit through formal dinners in complete silence before leaving immediately to be with his mistress, making no effort to hide where he was going or why. The degradation was public and designed to show exactly how worthless he considered his Habsburg marriage to be. Joanna's only value lay in producing heirs, and her body performed this function with painful efficiency. She became pregnant quickly and gave birth to a daughter, Eleonora, in 1567. But Francesco wanted sons, not daughters, and his disappointment was obvious to everyone at court. The pregnancies continued year after year, each one weakening her body while producing mostly dead children. Another daughter survived, then a son who died within days, then twins who never took their first breath. Each loss made Francesco colder and more distant until he stopped visiting her chambers entirely except when conception was necessary. He would fulfill his marital duty with mechanical efficiency before returning immediately to Bianca, leaving his wife alone in the darkness. The years of isolation and repeated loss destroyed her mentally in ways that became increasingly obvious. She withdrew completely from court life and spent hours each day in the chapel praying for relief that never came. She wore only black clothing and dismissed most of her ladies-in-waiting because she could not bear their pitying looks. She ate almost nothing and spoke to no one unless absolutely necessary. By her early 30s she had become a ghost in the palace, barely present even when standing in the same room as others. Her mind had been fragile for years, held together only by the thin thread of routine and religious devotion. When Francesco died suddenly in October 1578, that thread snapped completely and what remained of her sanity shattered beyond any hope of recovery. Francesco fell ill on October 7, 1578, with violent stomach pains and fever that progressed with alarming speed. The court physicians tried everything in their limited arsenal, including bloodletting and herbal remedies, but the Grand Duke continued to decline rapidly. He began vomiting blood. His skin turned yellow. Within 12 days he was dead at age 37. The official cause was declared to be malaria, which was common enough in the marshy regions around Florence to seem plausible. But rumors spread immediately through the court as they always did when powerful men died unexpectedly. Some said Bianca Capello had poisoned him because she feared he was planning to end their relationship. Others whispered that Joanna had finally taken revenge for years of public humiliation. A few even suggested political assassination by rival families who wanted to destabilize Medici power during a vulnerable transition. Joanna's reaction to his death terrified the servants who witnessed it. She did not cry or faint or show any of the conventional signs of grief that might have been expected from a widow. Instead, she demanded to see the body immediately and would not be denied. She entered Francesco's death chamber and stood over his corpse for hours with an expression of focused intensity that made people afraid to approach her or interrupt whatever was happening in her mind. Courtiers hurried around making funeral arrangements while she remained motionless beside the body. When her confessor finally convinced her to leave, she told him something that made his blood run cold. Francesco was not really gone, she insisted with absolute conviction. His soul was still there in the room, still close to her, waiting for something to happen that would allow him to return. Over the following weeks she stopped sleeping entirely. Palace servants heard her wandering the corridors at night calling Francesco's name in a voice that echoed through the empty halls. She searched through rooms as if expecting to find him hiding in corners or behind furniture. Her remaining ladies-in-waiting reported that she conducted long conversations with invisible presences in her private chambers, asking questions aloud and then pausing as if listening carefully to responses that no one else could hear. She would nod and speak again, carrying on dialogues with ghosts or delusions that existed only in her shattered mind. The court physicians were summoned to examine her and provide treatment. They diagnosed severe melancholia, which was their standard explanation for any mental disturbance in women who had suffered great losses. They prescribed the usual remedies of rest and prayer along with herbal medicines that were supposed to restore balance to the humors. Nothing helped at all. She was descending into a madness rooted in years of abuse and loss, and no one at the Medici court knew how to pull her back from the edge or even recognized how dangerous her mental state had become. The Medici family held urgent discussions about what should be done with the mad widow who was becoming an embarrassment. She was still a Habsburg archduchess with powerful family connections across Europe, which meant they could not simply lock her away in a convent or asylum without creating serious diplomatic problems with the Austrian branch of the family. But her increasingly bizarre behavior was becoming impossible to hide from visiting dignitaries and foreign ambassadors. Francesco's brother, Cardinal Ferdinando, who now controlled the family, considered sending her back to Austria where she would become someone else's problem. But her mental state made any kind of travel seem impossible and potentially dangerous. The situation seemed completely hopeless until a man named Marcello di Pisa requested an audience with the cardinal, claiming he possessed specialized knowledge that could help the grieving widow understand what had truly happened to her husband's soul. Marcello presented himself as a physician and natural philosopher who had studied at the University of Padua and traveled extensively in Ottoman lands where he learned things that Western doctors did not understand. When he heard about Joanna's conviction that Francesco's soul remained present, he recognized an opportunity. Most physicians of the era would have dismissed her claims as simple delusions requiring stronger sedatives and perhaps physical restraint. Marcello did something entirely different. He told her she was absolutely right, and then he explained exactly how she could bring Francesco back from death. In their first private meeting, Marcello explained the ancient doctrine of metempsychosis to Joanna with the confidence of someone revealing profound secrets. When a person died, he told her, the soul did not simply go to heaven or hell as Christian doctrine taught. Instead it sought immediate refuge in the nearest living creature, taking shelter in an animal's body while waiting desperately for a chance to return to human form. This was not heresy, he assured her very carefully, because Pythagoras himself had taught these principles and Plato had written about them extensively in his philosophical dialogues. The greatest minds of antiquity had understood this fundamental truth about the nature of existence that the Church had deliberately buried and hidden from common knowledge. Francesco's soul had survived his death exactly as she had sensed, Marcello explained with absolute certainty. Her instincts had been completely correct all along, and what she felt was not madness or delusion but genuine perception of spiritual reality. But Francesco's soul was now trapped inside an animal's body somewhere in Florence or the surrounding countryside. It was imprisoned there, waiting and calling out to her, desperate for her to find it and provide a pathway back to human existence. There was only one way to accomplish this resurrection and free Francesco from his animal prison. If she could identify which specific animal housed his soul and then conceive a child using that animal's seed, Francesco would be reborn through her body. The baby she carried and delivered would actually be her husband returned to life, complete with all his memories and knowledge from his previous existence. He would recognize her immediately upon birth. They would be reunited, and the terrible separation that death had imposed would be undone through this miraculous process. To Joanna's shattered mind, this theory offered something infinitely more powerful than reason or sanity could provide. It offered genuine hope where none had existed before. The crushing weight of grief that had been destroying her suddenly had a clear purpose and direction. She was not helpless anymore or just a widow mourning uselessly while the world moved on without her. She had become the only person in the entire world who could resurrect Francesco, the only one who possessed the ability to undo what death had done. The idea took hold of her mind immediately and consumed her thoughts completely, filling the void where sanity had once existed. Marcello continued building his theory with careful attention to practical details that would make the resurrection possible. He possessed surgical knowledge learned from studying ancient medical texts and working alongside physicians in Constantinople who understood procedures that Western doctors had never imagined. His plan was straightforward in concept but would require great care in execution. He would extract embryonic material from pregnant animals and introduce it directly into her womb using specialized medical instruments designed for exactly this delicate purpose. Each procedure would serve as a test to determine whether that particular animal harbored Francesco's soul within its body. When they finally identified the right creature, her body would instinctively recognize the presence of Francesco's soul and accept the pregnancy naturally. The child would develop normally over 9 months and be born as Francesco reborn into the world, exactly as he had been before death claimed him. She asked what needed to be done to begin this work immediately. Marcello's requirements were simple and direct. She would need to provide him with substantial gold to purchase animals and surgical equipment. A private chamber would need to be cleared and prepared where the procedures could be performed in absolute secrecy away from the eyes of servants or family members. And any servants who might witness the work would need to be sworn to complete silence under the most serious threats imaginable. The Medici family could not be allowed to know what they were attempting until Francesco actually walked the earth again and the miracle was complete and undeniable. If the church somehow discovered what they were doing before success was achieved, ecclesiastical authorities would declare the work heretical and imprison everyone involved regardless of how close they might be to achieving resurrection. Joanna agreed to everything without a single moment of hesitation or doubt. She gave Marcello immediate access to her personal treasury where years of widow's allowance had accumulated untouched. She ordered a remote chamber cleared in an unused wing of the palace where few servants ever ventured for any reason. She swore her few remaining loyal servants to absolute silence under threat of immediate dismissal and worse consequences if they betrayed what they might witness. Within just a few days all the preparations were complete, and Marcello had everything he needed to begin his terrible work that would ultimately kill her. The first procedure took place in November 1578, barely 1 month after Francesco's death when Joanna's grief was still raw and overwhelming. Marcello had obtained a pregnant dog from the Florence streets where such animals were common enough not to attract attention. In the secret chamber he killed the animal and performed a crude surgical extraction to remove the developing fetuses from inside its body. The dog died screaming on the floor while Marcello worked with his instruments. Then he turned his full attention to Joanna, who lay waiting on a table that had been prepared specifically for this purpose. She had raised her skirts and spread her legs in position. The physician used metal instruments to force the extracted material deep into her body, pushing it through her cervix and into her womb. The pain was worse than anything she had ever experienced during any of her difficult childbirths. It felt like being torn apart from the inside, like burning and cutting combined into one unbearable sensation. But she endured it without crying out or asking him to stop because she believed with absolute conviction that she was participating in a genuine miracle that would restore everything she had lost. Days passed and then weeks as she watched desperately for any sign of pregnancy that would confirm the procedure had worked. She examined her body constantly for changes. She waited for her monthly courses to stop. She pressed her hands against her belly hoping to feel movement or swelling. But her courses came normally at the expected time. Her belly remained completely flat. Nothing changed at all in her body's normal rhythms or functions. Marcello explained that this simply meant Francesco's soul was not housed inside a dog after all. They would need to try other animals and continue the systematic search until they found where his soul had taken refuge. She accepted this explanation without any question or doubt. The failure did not shake her faith in the underlying theory one bit. It just meant they had not yet found Francesco, and the search needed to continue with different creatures until they succeeded. Throughout the winter of 1578 and into early 1579, the procedures continued with horrifying regularity that became a kind of terrible routine in her life. Marcello obtained pregnant cats from the city alleys where they bred in large numbers. He acquired rabbits from the countryside markets. He even brought caged birds that were carrying eggs ready to hatch. Each time the same brutal pattern repeated itself in that secret chamber. He would kill the animal and extract whatever embryonic material he could find inside its body. Then he would turn to Joanna and use his instruments on her while she lay on the table enduring agony that grew worse with each successive attempt. Each time she waited desperately for signs of pregnancy that never came. Each time nothing happened to suggest any conception had occurred. Her body was naturally rejecting the foreign material because what they were attempting was biologically impossible at the most fundamental level. No human woman can conceive from animal tissue. The species barrier makes such conception completely impossible regardless of what procedures are performed. But instead of recognizing this basic truth, both Joanna and Marcello interpreted every failure as simply not having found the right animal yet. The logic became circular and self-reinforcing in a way that trapped them both. Each failure only proved they needed to keep searching more widely. Each disappointment became evidence that Francesco's soul must be housed in some other creature they had not yet tested. The repeated procedures destroyed Joanna's body in ways that became impossible to hide from the servants who attended her. The instruments Marcello used were crude and completely unsterilized. They were contaminated with animal blood and rotting tissue that introduced severe infection deep into her womb and surrounding organs. She developed chronic fever that never broke regardless of what remedies were tried. Constant pain radiated through her abdomen day and night without relief. She bled irregularly between her monthly courses as internal damage accumulated from the repeated trauma. Her appetite disappeared completely as nausea and pain made eating unbearable. Weight fell away until she looked skeletal and corpse-like. Her skin turned a grayish color that suggested serious illness approaching. She could barely walk without servants physically supporting her weight. Her hands trembled constantly. Her eyes took on a feverish glitter that alarmed anyone who looked directly at her. When her remaining ladies-in-waiting tried to express concern about the obvious deterioration they were witnessing, she became angry and dismissed their worries. The pain was necessary, she insisted with surprising vehemence for someone so physically weakened. Francesco was waiting somewhere out there, trapped in an animal's body and desperate to return to her. How could she possibly abandon that search just because of temporary physical discomfort that seemed minor compared to the ultimate goal? The suffering was actually proof of her devotion, she argued. It was evidence of love that transcended even death itself. She would endure absolutely anything to bring him back to the world of the living where he belonged. By early spring of 1579, a new theory had taken hold in her fevered thinking. She spent long hours analyzing Francesco's life and interests, trying to determine which animal might house his wandering soul. Her memory focused particularly on his passion for hunting, which had been one of his few genuine enthusiasms during life. He had spent many days in the Tuscan forests pursuing game with his dogs and hunting companions. Francesco had talked endlessly about the thrill of the chase and the satisfaction of bringing down worthy prey. He had particularly loved hunting deer above all other animals. He spoke constantly of the nobility of the stag and the challenge of tracking such intelligent and elusive creatures through dense forests. He kept trophy antlers mounted in his private chambers as reminders of successful hunts. Perhaps his soul had found refuge in one of those majestic creatures he had pursued so enthusiastically and killed so proudly during his lifetime. The connection seemed obvious to her deranged reasoning, a kind of poetic justice that his soul would shelter in the body of an animal he had loved to hunt. When she told Marcello this new theory, he agreed immediately and enthusiastically that a deer made perfect sense. This was exactly the kind of symbolic connection that ancient wisdom taught governed the soul's journey after death. They had been wasting time searching among common animals like dogs and cats that had no real connection to Francesco's life or interests. But Francesco's soul would naturally seek a more noble vessel that matched his status as Grand Duke of Tuscany. A deer was precisely right, and this must be what they had been searching for through all the failed attempts. Success was finally within reach. Finding a pregnant deer proved considerably more difficult than acquiring common animals from city streets or markets. Deer were not found within Florence itself, and hunting season restrictions made them difficult to obtain through normal legal channels. Marcello spent weeks making careful inquiries and bribing hunters throughout the Tuscan countryside. He finally located one who had captured a doe that was visibly heavy with fawn, clearly in the late stages of pregnancy. The hunter asked questions about why anyone would want a pregnant deer alive rather than butchered for its valuable meat and hide. But Marcello's gold silenced his curiosity effectively, and no further questions were asked. The animal was brought to the palace hidden inside a covered cart under the protection of darkness. Servants helped move the frightened creature to the secret chamber where Joanna waited in a state of feverish anticipation that bordered on delirium. This was finally it, she believed with absolute certainty that transcended any rational doubt. After all the failed attempts and months of suffering, after searching through so many different creatures without success, she would finally bring Francesco back to life. The deer contained his soul, and the child she would conceive would be her husband reborn into the world. Everything she had endured would be justified and redeemed through this final miraculous procedure. What happened in that chamber on April 7, 1579, was documented only in fragmentary accounts pieced together from the horrified testimony of servants who glimpsed pieces of the scene. The deer was killed first because a living animal would struggle too violently during the extraction process. Its throat was cut quickly and blood poured across the floor. Then Marcello began his brutal work of butchering the carcass to reach the fetus developing inside. He hacked at the doe's swollen belly with crude instruments, cutting through hide and muscle and organ tissue. The chamber filled with blood and the overwhelming stench of animal viscera as he worked. The material he finally extracted was heavily contaminated and already beginning to decompose in the warm air of the chamber. But stopping at this point was completely unthinkable after all the effort invested in obtaining this particular animal. Joanna lay waiting on the table in a state of delirium produced by fever and desperate anticipation of what was about to happen. Her body had already been severely weakened by months of repeated infections and malnutrition from barely eating. Marcello used his instruments to introduce the decaying deer tissue deep into her womb, pushing it past her cervix and forcing it into direct contact with her internal organs. The contamination he introduced was massive and immediate in its effects. The rotting tissue carried countless bacteria along with other pathogens that invaded a bodily system already compromised by previous procedures. Some historians suggest the deer may have carried bubonic plague transmitted by fleas in its fur, which would explain the rapid progression of symptoms that followed. Within just a few hours she fell catastrophically ill in ways that terrified everyone who witnessed her condition. The infection progressed with speed that seemed almost supernatural to observers who did not understand the nature of septic shock. Her fever spiked so violently that servants who touched her skin reported it felt like heated metal that could burn. The abdomen began to swell grotesquely as internal bleeding spread through damaged organs. Convulsions started that were so violent it took 3 strong servants to hold her body down on the bed and prevent injury. Vomiting brought up blood and bile repeatedly until there was nothing left in her stomach. The stench in her chamber became so unbearable that servants could barely stand to enter even when duty required it. By the second day her ladies-in-waiting finally overcame their fear of breaking her strict orders and summoned the court physicians. When the doctors arrived and examined her, they were absolutely horrified by what they discovered. The abdomen was rigid and swollen far beyond what any pregnancy could cause. The skin was hot to the touch and covered in dark bruises that indicated massive internal damage. When they attempted to examine her internally to understand what was happening, The smell that emerged made several of them recoil in disgust and horror at what had been done to her. The contaminated animal tissue had introduced a catastrophic infection into her uterus and all the surrounding organs. The infection was spreading rapidly through her bloodstream and poisoning her entire system beyond any hope of recovery. The physicians recognized immediately that there was absolutely nothing they could do with the limited medical knowledge available to them in that era. They attempted their standard treatments anyway because doing nothing seemed worse than admitting complete helplessness. More bloodletting was performed in hopes of draining the poison from her system. Strong purgatives were administered. Herbal poultices were applied to the grotesquely swollen belly. Nothing helped at all. Her organs were failing one by one. Her kidneys had stopped functioning. Her liver was shutting down. The infection had progressed far beyond the point where any intervention could possibly save her life. Marcello had disappeared the very moment the physicians arrived in her chamber. He vanished from Florence completely that same day, taking whatever gold remained from what he had been given over the months of procedures. Whether he fled primarily from fear of prosecution for what he had done or simply because he knew his patient was about to die and wanted to escape before awkward questions were asked remains unknown to historians studying the case. Either way, he was never seen in Florence again, and his true identity was never definitively established by authorities who later investigated. Through all of this unbearable suffering, even as death approached hour by hour, the delusion remained completely intact in her failing mind. During brief moments of lucidity that came between the violent convulsions, she kept asking the physicians whether the pregnancy had successfully taken hold. Were there any signs that Francesco was beginning to grow inside her body? She clutched desperately at their hands and begged them to confirm that the procedure had worked as Marcello had promised. She needed to know that her husband would be reborn and that all this suffering had served its intended purpose of bringing him back. The physicians exchanged horrified glances with each other but said nothing in response to her desperate questions. What could possibly be said to a dying woman who had destroyed herself chasing an impossible dream that had no basis in reality? They could not bring themselves to confirm the delusion that was killing her, but neither could they find words to explain the terrible truth of what had actually happened in that secret chamber. Joanna of Austria died on April 10, 1579, exactly 3 days after the final procedure that killed her. She was 31 years old and had suffered unimaginably in her final days. The official cause of death was recorded simply as fever following melancholic illness. This diagnosis was deliberately vague and designed to hide what had actually occurred. The Medici family moved with remarkable speed to suppress all information about the true circumstances of her death. Cardinal Ferdinando understood immediately that the full story would bring enormous scandal and lasting shame to the Medici house if it became public knowledge. The secret chamber was stripped of everything and cleaned so thoroughly that no trace remained of what had happened there. The servants who had witnessed any part of the procedures were dismissed immediately and scattered across Italy. Many received gold along with stern warnings to ensure their permanent silence about what they had seen. Every piece of physical evidence was systematically destroyed. Her burial took place quickly in the Basilica of San Lorenzo, where many Medici family members rested. The tomb was simple and revealed absolutely nothing about how death had actually occurred. The story should have disappeared completely at that point, buried along with her body and forgotten as just another royal woman who died young from illness during an era when such deaths were tragically common. But small fragments of the truth survived despite all efforts at suppression. Private letters written by courtiers mentioned strange rumors that circulated through Florence about animal sacrifices and bizarre medical experiments. Whispered stories spoke of a mad widow who believed she could resurrect her dead husband through unnatural procedures. These fragmentary references were preserved in various archives across Italy and eventually discovered by historians researching the Medici period centuries later. When scholars finally pieced together these scattered references, the full story that emerged revealed a tragedy that exposed the profound vulnerability of royal women during the Renaissance era. Joanna's entire life had been spent as a political pawn, married off for dynastic advantage and expected to produce heirs who would strengthen family alliances. When she failed to provide the sons that Francesco demanded, public humiliation became her daily reality. When overwhelming grief finally shattered whatever remained of her sanity after years of abuse, there was no system of care or protection available to help her. Instead, she fell victim to a charlatan who deliberately exploited her mental illness for financial gain. The procedures that Marcello performed were medically impossible from the very beginning. No human woman can become pregnant from animal embryos under any circumstances. The species barrier makes such conception fundamentally impossible at the genetic level. Marcello almost certainly understood this basic biological fact given his claimed medical education. This means he was deliberately and cynically exploiting a mentally ill woman's delusions while taking her money and performing invasive procedures that could only harm her and had no possibility whatsoever of achieving what he promised. Whether he actually intended to kill her or simply did not care about the inevitable consequences of his actions remains a question historians cannot definitively answer, but the result was exactly the same regardless of his true intentions. His intervention led directly to her death just as surely as if he had administered poison. The tragedy stands as a powerful reminder of how completely grief can destroy human reason when it becomes overwhelming and finds no healthy outlet. It demonstrates how profoundly mental illness was misunderstood and mistreated in past centuries when no real psychiatric care existed. And it shows how the vulnerable have always been prey for those willing to exploit suffering for personal profit. Her tomb in Florence offers no hint whatsoever of this terrible history to modern visitors who pass by it today. They see only another name carved in stone among the many Medici family members. Another forgotten royal woman whose life and death seem unremarkable from the distance of centuries. But the truth remains preserved in those fragmentary historical accounts, standing as an eternal testament to one woman's desperate attempt to cheat death and bring back the husband who never loved her, and the terrible price she paid for believing that love could somehow conquer even the absolute finality of death itself.